Gruffudd was missing from the list of Llywelyn ap Iorwerth's children. The reason for that is that list just focused on those children who married into Marcher families. It wasn't meant to be an exhaustive list of Llywelyn's children. But if we look at the family tree here, then what this begins to show is that through the marriage of Ralph Mortimer, the speakers this morning told us about the marriage of Ralph Mortimer and Gladys Thi, the daughter of Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, and how that very much was part of Llywelyn's policy of binding his family with the Marcher Lords and managing the political situation. We can't be sure who the mother of Gladys Thi was. As was mentioned this morning, Llywelyn ap Iorwerth married Joan, the daughter of King John, illegitimate daughter, though later legitimised. Before that marriage, then Llywelyn had had a long-standing relationship with Tanchwysl Goch. And it is generally thought that Gladys Thi was a child of that relationship. Certainly, Llywelyn's eldest son, Gruffudd, was born from that relationship. And so we have a situation where the son of Ralph Mortimer and Gladys is a full cousin to Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, the son of Gruffudd ap Llywelyn. I want to just start, in terms of setting the context, by quickly looking at the events of 1241. We've already heard this morning how the polity that had been created by Llywelyn ap Iorwerth dissipated after his death, that his designated heir, Dafydd, was unable to reclaim that polity, that Henry III recognised him as the ruler of Gwynedd, but not of having a supremacy across all of Wales. The fact that Dafydd had inherited was in itself controversial because Gruffudd was the elder brother. However, and in Welsh law would have been recognised as such, because Welsh law did not make a distinction between children born through wedlock recognised by the church and through other relationships. But Llywelyn had recognised Dafydd as his heir. And Dafydd had imprisoned his brother Gruffudd. And in 1241, Gruffudd's wife, Sinanna, reached an agreement with Henry III, King of England, that he would help to undertake the release of her husband Gruffudd from Dafydd's imprisonment, and for which she undertook the payment of 600 marks. The first person who is listed as the signatory to that agreement is Ralph Mortimer, and as the first signatory, he and the other signatories were also pledging to make good that payment if Sinanna and Gruffudd were unable to meet it. So clearly, Ralph Mortimer was very much involved in those negotiations for the release of Gruffudd. And if, as is probable, his wife, Gladys Thi, was the full sister of Gruffudd, then there is clearly a very strong family relationship. Ralph, no doubt, also had motivations, but he was trying to split the ruling family as well. But there was that very strong family motivation. Almost certainly, at exactly the same time, then Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, the son of Gruffudd, quitclaimed all his rights to lands in Maliennydd and Gwerthwynion, and quitclaimed those to Ralph Mortimer and to his wife. Now, almost certainly, that's a quid pro quo. Llywelyn ap Gruffydd had been given lands in Maliennith and Gwerthonion by his grandfather. And so clearly what is happening here is that Ralph is highly involved in negotiating the release of Gruffydd, but he demands a payback, which is that his son Llywelyn quick claims his rights to the lands that the Mortimers are claiming in Maliennith. The first time that we see the young Roger Mortimer is in 1242, when the Chronicle of the Princes, the Briti Iwtiwisogion, records that in that year these castles were fortified in Wales by Roger Mortimer, the castles of Maliennith at Cefn-Clys and Nuckless. Roger was only about 10 or 11 at the time. His father was on royal business on the continent, and so the precocious 11-year-old Roger Mortimer was given responsibility for building those castles. 4 years later, in 1246, the lives of Roger Mortimer and Llywelyn ap Gruffydd begin to move in parallel, and a symmetry begins to emerge. Because again, as recorded, in 1246, Dafydd ap Llywelyn died at Aber in the month of March. And since he had no heirs of his body, Owain Goch and Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, his nephews, sons of Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, his brother, ruled after him. So Llywelyn, initially in partnership with his brother, assumed the rule of Gwynedd. In the same year, the Chronicle also records that that year died Ralph Mortimer, and in his place arose Roger, his son. The biblical language, I think, is quite interesting. And so the key events of those two people, for both grandsons of Llywelyn ap Iorwerth, both full first cousins, their lives are brought together, and from then on until they both died in the same year in 1282, their lives are intertwined. Llywelyn ap Gruffydd, his priority was to establish his rule and his power across Gwynedd. But then in 1256, when the people of Wales were chafing under the harsh rule of the English officials, particularly in North East Wales, and the people of North East Wales invited Llywelyn to come to their aid. And Llywelyn needed no further asking, and immediately took his army into North East Wales, and having conquered those lands, went on a circular route around Wales, establishing his authority across all of Wales. And on his way back, it is recorded that he gained possession of Gwerthonion from Roger Mortimer, taking it into his own hand. So only 15 years after he had solemnly quitclaimed all his rights to those lands, then in 1256 he took them back by force of arms. 4 years later, then Llywelyn seized the castle of Builth, which, although not a Mortimer property, Roger Mortimer had been made. Builth was a royal castle, and Roger Mortimer had been given the stewardship of it. And so he had custody of Builth. He wasn't himself present when Llywelyn seized Builth Castle, but he took much of the blame for having allowed Llywelyn to seize it. And then, just 2 years after that, as our speakers this morning recounted, the men of Maliennith seized Cefn-Clys, and when Roger occupied the castle, it was then encircled by the forces of Llywelyn, who, whilst Roger was holed up in Cefn-Clys, then Llywelyn's forces rampaged around Maliennith, burning a number of castles in the border region, forcing Roger to surrender and retreat back to Wigmore. So that's just a very quick setting the scene, setting the context of the relationship between Roger Mortimer and Llywelyn ap Griffith.